I never thought my life would unravel the way it did. You think you know who you are, what you're capable of, the lines you'd never cross. But then one day, you wake up and realize you've stepped so far over those lines, you can't even see where they were. It's not easy to say this out loud. I've been carrying this for so long, trying to bury it, trying to pretend it never happened. But secrets have a way of clawing their way to the surface, don't they? And mine destroyed everything I thought I knew about myself, about my family, about love. I've been married for 10 years. 10 years of routines, compromises, shared memories. My husband is a good man, a man who trusted me, who believed in me. He gave me stability when I felt lost, and for a long time, I thought that was enough. But marriage isn't just about stability, is it? There's a quiet loneliness that creeps in when you start to feel invisible. When the laughter fades, when the conversations become about schedules and grocery lists, when the person who once made you feel alive now barely looks you in the eye. I told myself it was normal. That every marriage has its seasons, its ups and downs. And maybe that's true. But what I didn't realize was how vulnerable that loneliness made me. How it left cracks in my heart that I didn't even know were there. And then there was him. My stepson. It feels wrong just to say those words. To admit that what happened wasn't a fleeting thought, a moment I could dismiss. He wasn't just a boy in my home. He was someone I'd watched grow, someone I'd helped guide through life. Someone I should have protected. But this isn't about what I should have done. This is about what I did. I don't even know when it started, when the lines began to blur. At first, it was just small things, a compliment, a shared laugh, a conversation that lingered longer than it should have. Things that seemed innocent enough in the moment but, looking back, were anything but. You might wonder how it's even possible. How a woman who's supposed to be a mother figure could let something like this happen. I ask myself that question every day. The truth is, I don't have a simple answer. Maybe it was loneliness. Maybe it was the way he looked at me, like I was someone worth noticing, worth listening to. Or maybe it was something darker, something I don't want to admit even to myself. There were warning signs, moments when I felt the weight of what was happening and tried to stop it. But those moments were fleeting, drowned out by the rush of something I hadn't felt in years. It wasn't just about attraction. It was about feeling alive again, about being seen in a way I hadn't been in so long. This isn't a story I want to tell. It's not something I'm proud of or something I can justify. It's a confession, plain and simple. A story about how one decision, one moment of weakness, can ripple out and destroy everything you hold dear. But before I go on, let me ask you this, have you ever made a mistake so big, so life-altering, that it changed the way you saw yourself? Have you ever looked in the mirror and felt like a stranger, like you didn't recognize the person staring back at you? That's where I was. And that's where this story begins. When I married him, I thought I'd found my forever. Isn't that what we all hope for? Someone to anchor us, to build a life with, to share the quiet moments that come after the storms. That's what he was for me, a safe harbor, a steady presence in a world that often felt too chaotic. We met during a time when I wasn't sure I'd ever trust again. He was kind, patient, the kind of man who made you feel like the world wasn't such a bad place after all. And when he asked me to marry him, I said yes without hesitation. It felt like the right choice. It felt safe. The early years were good. We had our routines, our rituals, the little things that make a marriage feel solid. But over time, something shifted. Or maybe it didn't shift so much as it faded, like a light growing dimmer, so gradually you don't notice until you're sitting in the dark. It wasn't one big thing, nothing dramatic. It was the accumulation of small things. Conversations that felt more like checklists than connections. The way his touch became more routine than tender. The way we started existing side by side rather than together. I told myself it was normal. Every marriage has its quiet spells, its moments when the spark flickers but doesn't quite go out. I thought we'd find our way back to each other eventually. And then there was his son, my stepson. He was 16 when we got married, a boy trying to figure out his place in a new family. He was polite, always polite, but there was a distance between us that I couldn't quite bridge. I understood it. I wasn't his mother, and I never tried to be. I just wanted to be someone he could rely on, someone he could trust. It took time, but we found our rhythm. Slowly, we started building something that felt real. We'd talk about school, his friends, his plans for the future. I thought we'd reached a place where we both felt comfortable, even if it wasn't perfect. But looking back, I wonder if I misunderstood those moments. If I saw what I wanted to see instead of what was really there. He wasn't a boy anymore by the time things started to change. He was a young man, confident, independent, with a way of carrying himself that made you forget how young he really was. He had this energy, this presence, that filled the room without even trying. And when he looked at you, it was like he saw everything. At first, I didn't think much of it. Why would I? He was my stepson. But the tension in our household made it harder to ignore the way I felt. My husband and I were drifting further apart. The silence between us grew heavier, filled with words we didn't say and feelings we didn't share. I spent more time alone, filling the emptiness with anything I could, projects, volunteering, anything to keep my mind occupied. But no matter what I did, the loneliness crept in, like a shadow I couldn't escape. And then, there was him. He was always there, always present in a way my husband wasn't. He listened when I spoke, and asked questions that felt genuine. He noticed things, small things that no one else did. "You look tired today," he'd say, or, "You should take some time for yourself." It was nothing, really. Just little comments, little moments. But when you're starving for connection, even crumbs can feel like a feast. I think the signs were always there, now that I look back. The glances that lingered too long, the conversations that felt too personal. But I didn't see them, or maybe I didn't want to. Because the truth is, I needed something, someone, to fill the emptiness inside me. And for reasons I still don't fully understand, he became that someone. I told myself it was innocent. That the bond we were forming was normal, healthy even. But deep down, I think I knew better. There were moments when I'd catch myself staring at him, wondering why I felt the way I did. I'd tell myself it was nothing, just a passing thought. But those thoughts didn't go away. They grew, slowly at first, until they were all I could think about. The tension in the house became almost unbearable, a quiet undercurrent of emotions we didn't acknowledge but couldn't ignore. And in the middle of it all was my husband, kind, trusting, completely unaware of the storm that was building around him. I wish I could say I stopped it before it went too far. That I recognized the danger and pulled back. But I didn't. And that's where everything started to fall apart. It started so small, I barely noticed it. A conversation that lingered a little too long. A glance that felt different. I told myself it was nothing, that I was overthinking, that these were moments anyone could have. But as time passed, those moments grew heavier, filled with something unspoken. It was after dinner one evening, just the two of us left at the table. My husband had gone to take a call, and we sat there, talking about nothing in particular, his plans for the weekend, a movie he'd seen. The conversation was easy, natural, but then he said something that caught me off guard. "You're the only person I feel like I can really talk to," he said. I remember looking at him, unsure of how to respond. His words were so sincere, so raw, that they felt out of place. I laughed it off, made a joke about how teenagers never talk to their parents. But inside, something shifted. That was the first time I felt it, that strange, electric pull that I couldn't quite explain. It wasn't attraction, not then. It was a connection. And that connection became a thread that tied us together in ways I didn't fully understand. At first, I thought it was harmless. After all, what was wrong with talking? Listening? Being there for someone who needed support? I told myself I was just being a good stepmother, that I was filling the role I was supposed to. But deep down, I think I knew better. There was a moment a few weeks later when I realized things were changing. We were in the kitchen, both reaching for the same dish, and our hands brushed. It was such a small thing, something that shouldn't have mattered. But the way he looked at me in that moment, like time had stopped, like he was seeing something he wasn't supposed to, made my heart race. I pulled my hand back quickly, laughing nervously, but the feeling lingered. I told myself it was nothing. Just a fleeting moment. But those moments started happening more often. The way he'd look at me when no one else was around. The way our conversations seemed to stretch longer and longer, as if neither of us wanted them to end. The way he'd find reasons to be near me, to help with things that didn't need helping with. And then, there were the things he said. "You work so hard, but no one seems to notice," he told me one afternoon while we were tidying up. I laughed it off, as I always did, but his words stayed with me. Because he was right. I did work really hard. I did give everything I had to my family, to my marriage, to a life that often felt like it was draining me dry. And for the first time in years, someone had noticed. It wasn't just his words, though. It was the way he listened. Really listened. When I talked, he didn't just nod and wait for his turn to speak. He asked questions, remembered the little details, made me feel like what I said mattered. Like I mattered. And that's what I'd been missing. You see, my husband loved me, but somewhere along the way, we'd stopped really seeing each other. Our lives had become a routine, a series of motions we went through without thinking. But with him, with my stepson, I felt alive again. I felt wanted. That's a dangerous feeling. Every time I told myself to stop, to pull back, I found myself drawn back in. The pull was stronger than my guilt, stronger than the little voice in my head telling me to turn around before it was too late. There was one evening that stands out in my mind. My husband was working late, and we ended up watching a movie together. I don't even remember what the movie was about, it didn't matter. What I remember is how close we were sitting, how the air between us felt charged with something I couldn't name. At one point, our hands brushed. It was nothing, just an accident, but neither of us moved away. The silence stretched between us, thick and heavy, until finally, I pulled my hand back and stood up. I think I'm going to head to bed, I said, my voice shaking. He nodded, his eyes locked on mine, and for a moment, I thought he was going to say something. But he didn't. And I walked away, my heart pounding in my chest, my thoughts racing. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the moment in my head, wondering what it meant, what I should do. But I didn't have any answers. All I knew was that something had shifted between us, and there was no going back. The tension between us grew stronger with each passing day. It was in the way he looked at me, the way he lingered in the room when I was there, the way our conversations felt like they were teetering on the edge of something unspoken. And then, there was the moment I knew I'd crossed the line. It was late, and I was sitting in the living room, scrolling mindlessly through my phone. He walked in, sat down next to me, and started talking about something that had happened at school. I don't even remember what it was, it didn't matter. What mattered was the way he looked at me when he finished speaking. "You're the only one who gets me," he said. I should have stopped it then. I should have set boundaries, told him that this wasn't right. But instead, I smiled and said, "I get you because I care." And in that moment, I knew I was in too deep. I wish I could say I pulled back, that I found a way to end it before it went too far. But I didn't. Because the truth is, I didn't want to. I didn't want to lose the way he made me feel, the way he made me feel seen, heard, alive. And that's how it started. Not with a kiss, not with a confession, but with 1,000 little moments that built into something I couldn't control. Something I couldn't stop. It happened on a quiet night. Isn't that always how it starts? Not with fireworks or grand gestures, but with silence, heavy, suffocating silence that leaves too much room for thoughts you shouldn't be thinking. My husband was out of town for work, as he often was, and the house felt unusually still. I'd spent the evening cleaning, trying to distract myself from the strange tension that had settled over me like a second skin. I wasn't expecting him, my stepson, to come home early. But when he walked through the door, I felt that familiar jolt, that mix of relief and dread that I'd started to associate with him. We ended up in the living room, as we often did, talking about nothing and everything all at once. The conversation was light at first, about his classes, funny stories about his friends. But then it shifted, as it always seemed to. "Do you ever feel like no one really understands you?" he asked, his voice soft, almost hesitant. I froze for a moment, unsure of how to answer. Because the truth was, I did. I felt that way every single day. "I think everyone feels like that sometimes," I said finally, my voice quieter than I intended. He looked at me then, his eyes so full of something I couldn't name, something that made my chest tighten and my breath catch. "Not everyone," he said. "Not with you." The words hung in the air between us, heavy and impossible to ignore. I should have said something, anything, to break the tension, to remind us both of the boundaries we were standing on. But I didn't. I don't know who moved first. Maybe it was him. Maybe it was me. All I remember is the sudden, unbearable closeness, the way his hand brushed mine, the way his breath felt warm against my skin. And then. It happened. It was a kiss. Just a kiss, but it felt like the world had shifted, like every rule, every line, every piece of sense and reason had been wiped away in an instant. For a moment, I couldn't think, couldn't breathe. All I could feel was the weight of what we'd just done, the way it seemed to hang in the air around us, suffocating and intoxicating all at once. "I'm sorry," I whispered, pulling away, my voice shaking. But he didn't look sorry. He looked relieved. Like he'd been waiting for this, hoping for it. And that realization terrified me. I went to bed that night feeling like I was suffocating under the weight of my own guilt. I told myself it was a mistake, a moment of weakness that wouldn't happen again. But deep down, I knew better. The next morning, I couldn't even look at him. I avoided him as much as I could, throwing myself into chores, errands, anything to keep my mind busy. But every time I passed him in the hall, every time our eyes met, I felt that same pull, that same unbearable tension. And then it happened again. This time, it wasn't an accident. It wasn't a moment that caught us off guard. It was deliberate. We were in the kitchen, late at night, the rest of the house dark and quiet. I'd gone down for a glass of water, hoping the stillness would calm my racing thoughts. But he was there, leaning against the counter, waiting. "We need to talk," he said, his voice low, steady. I shook my head, my heart pounding so loudly I thought he'd hear it. "There's nothing to talk about," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. But he stepped closer, and suddenly, there was no space between us, no air, no room for anything but the weight of what we both knew was coming. "This isn't right," I said, even as my resolve crumbled. "I don't care," he said. "I can't stop thinking about you." And that was it. The moment the last of my resistance shattered. I wish I could tell you that I stopped it. That I found the strength to walk away, to protect him, to protect myself. But I didn't. Because in that moment, all I could think about was how much I wanted to feel something, anything, besides the crushing emptiness I'd been carrying for so long. Afterward, I felt sick. Disgusted with myself. I stood in the bathroom, staring at my reflection, wondering how I'd become this person. How I'd let myself cross a line I swore I'd never even approach. But the damage was already done. And the worst part? It didn't stop there. Each time we crossed paths, the pull grew stronger, the guilt sharper, the lines blurrier. We told ourselves it would be the last time, that we'd stop before it got out of hand. But it was already out of hand. Every glance, every word, felt like a clue waiting to be found. I started to notice the way my husband looked at me, the way he seemed to sense that something was off. The way my stepson avoided him, his guilt written all over his face. I was walking on a razor's edge, and I knew it couldn't last. But I couldn't stop. The secrecy, the risk, it became intoxicating in its own twisted way. But with every stolen moment, every whispered word, I felt the walls closing in around me. And the worst part? I knew it was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down. Secrets don't stay hidden forever. I should have known that. I should have seen the signs, the moments when the walls around my lies started to crack. But I ignored them. I thought I could control it, that I could keep everything in its little compartment, separate from the rest of my life. I was wrong. It happened late one night, as these things often do. My husband had been distant for weeks, more than usual. I thought it was work, stress, maybe even exhaustion from our strained relationship. But looking back, I realized he was watching, piecing things together in ways I hadn't noticed. I didn't know he'd seen the messages. I didn't know he was standing outside the door that night, listening. My stepson and I had become careless. Or maybe we'd stopped caring altogether, so wrapped up in our own bubble that we didn't think about who might be watching, who might be paying attention. It was a message that tipped him off. Just one. I thought I'd deleted it, but I hadn't. I'd left it sitting there, glowing on the screen, an unspoken confession waiting to be found. He confronted me in the middle of the night. I was sitting in bed, reading, trying to distract myself from the growing guilt that had taken root in my chest. He walked in, his face pale, his hands trembling, holding my phone. "What is this?" he asked, his voice shaking. For a moment, I couldn't move. Couldn't speak. It felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. "It's nothing," I stammered, my voice weak and unconvincing. But he didn't believe me. How could he? The words on that screen said everything I was too afraid to admit. "I heard you," he said, his voice breaking. "The other night. You were in the kitchen with him." I didn't want to believe it, but... His voice trailed off, and he looked at me like I was a stranger. Like I was someone he couldn't even recognize. And in that moment, I knew there was no escaping it. No way to spin it, to explain it away. The truth was out. I tried to speak, to say something, anything, but the words wouldn't come. My throat felt tight, my chest heavy. "How could you?" he demanded, his voice rising. "With him? He's my son, for God's sake." The weight of his words hit me like a blow. I wanted to tell him I was sorry, that I hadn't meant for any of this to happen. But how do you apologize for something so unforgivable? How do you explain something you can't even justify to yourself? "It wasn't supposed to happen," I whispered, my voice barely audible. He laughed then, a bitter, hollow sound that made my stomach twist. "Not supposed to happen? Is that all you have to say?" And then, the door opened. My stepson stood there, his face pale, his eyes wide with fear and shame. He must have heard the shouting, must have known what was coming. But seeing him there, standing in the doorway, made everything feel more real, more impossible to ignore. "Get out," my husband said, his voice cold, shaking with fury. "Both of you. Get out of my house." I looked at my stepson, and for a moment, we were both frozen, caught in the wreckage of what we'd done. But then he turned and walked away, and I followed, my legs feeling like they would give out with every step. The door slammed behind us, the sound echoing in my ears, and suddenly, the world felt too big, too loud, too real. We sat in my car, neither of us speaking, the silence between us heavy with everything we couldn't say. I couldn't look at him, couldn't face the reality of what we'd done and the damage it had caused. "What do we do now?" he asked finally, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't have an answer. I didn't have anything. In one moment, everything I'd built came crashing down. My family, my marriage, my sense of who I was, it was all gone. And as I sat there in the dark, the weight of what I'd lost threatened to crush me. Because this wasn't just a mistake. It was a betrayal so deep, so devastating, that there was no way to undo it. No way to go back to the life I'd had before. And I knew, in that moment, that I would spend the rest of my life trying to make sense of what I'd done, and trying, somehow, to move forward from the wreckage I'd left behind. I lost everything. My husband. My home. Even my sense of self. It's strange how quickly life can fall apart, how one moment can shatter everything you thought was solid. The days after that night felt like a blur. My husband filed for divorce almost immediately, and I didn't fight him. How could I? I knew there was no coming back from what I'd done. No apology, no explanation, could ever undo the damage. He moved out first, then my stepson. The house became unbearably quiet, the kind of silence that presses down on you, reminding you of what you've lost. I'd walk through the empty rooms, seeing reminders of the life I'd had, the framed photos, the furniture we picked out together, the little things that once felt so permanent. Now, they were just ghosts of a life I'd destroyed. My stepson didn't speak to me again. Not directly. He left a note the day he moved out. Just a few words, "I'm sorry." That was it. I stared at that note for hours, trying to understand what he meant. Was he sorry for what we'd done? For the pain it caused? Or was he apologizing for walking away? I didn't know. I still don't. What I do know is that he was hurt, more than I think I'll ever understand. He was young, vulnerable, and I'd put him in a situation he wasn't ready for. I'd taken something from him, something he'll never get back. And that's a guilt I'll carry with me for the rest of my life. I tried to pick up the pieces of what was left, but there wasn't much to hold on to. Friends who used to call stopped answering. Neighbors I'd known for years avoided eye contact when we crossed paths. It was like I'd become invisible, or worse, like I didn't exist at all. And maybe I didn't. Not in the way I used to. I started therapy, not because I thought it would fix me, but because I didn't know what else to do. I needed to understand how I'd let things get so far, how I'd become the person who could do something like this. Therapy was hard. It forced me to look at parts of myself I'd spent years avoiding, the loneliness, the insecurity, the deep, unspoken fears that had driven me to seek comfort in the wrong places. It wasn't easy to face those truths, but it was necessary. I realized that what I was looking for wasn't something my husband or my stepson could have given me. It was something I needed to find within myself. And that was the hardest lesson of all. I started journaling, writing down everything I felt, every regret, every question, every small step forward. It was messy at first, full of anger and pain and confusion. But over time, it became a kind of release, a way to process what I couldn't say out loud. I also tried to make amends, as much as I could. I wrote letters to my husband and my stepson, apologizing for what I'd done, for the hurt I'd caused. I don't know if they ever read them. I don't know if they ever will. But writing them helped me, even if it didn't change anything for them. The truth is, some things can't be fixed. Some wounds don't heal, no matter how much time passes. But I've learned that doesn't mean you stop trying. It doesn't mean you stop growing. The hardest part of all this has been forgiving myself. It's easy to get lost in guilt, to let it consume you until you feel like you don't deserve to move forward. And for a long time, I felt that way. But guilt doesn't help anyone. It doesn't undo the past, and it doesn't build a future. I had to learn how to forgive myself, not because I deserved it, but because I couldn't live the rest of my life trapped in the shadow of my mistakes. Forgiveness didn't come quickly, and it didn't come easily. It came in small moments, in tiny victories, in the slow realization that I could still choose to be better. Mistakes don't define us. They shape us, yes, but they don't have to be the whole story. What defines us is what we do next, how we move forward, how we take responsibility for the damage we've caused. I'll never stop regretting what I did. I'll never stop wishing I could go back and make a different choice. But I'm learning to live with those regrets, to carry them without letting them crush me. And maybe that's the best I can hope for. So, here I am, still trying to piece together a life from the wreckage. It's not the life I had before, and it never will be. But it's mine. And for the first time in a long time, I'm learning how to live it. This isn't a story about seeking forgiveness. It's not about excusing what I did or trying to justify the choices I made. There are no excuses for what happened, and I know that. This is about something else, about facing the truth. About looking at myself, my actions, and the damage I caused, and choosing not to look away. For so long, I tried to avoid that truth. I buried it, hid from it, pretended it wasn't as bad as it was. But the thing about the truth is, it doesn't disappear just because you close your eyes. It waits. And when you finally face it, it doesn't just show you who you are, it shows you who you've been, and who you could be. If there's one thing I've learned from all of this, it's that mistakes, even the worst ones, don't have to be the end of the story. They can be a beginning, too, a chance to grow, to change, to be better. That's what I'm trying to do now. I'll never undo the pain I caused. I'll never erase the hurt I inflicted on the people I cared about most. That will always be a part of me, a shadow I carry. But it doesn't have to be the only part. Every day, I make a choice. A choice to be honest, to take responsibility, to show up in the world as someone who is trying to do better. It's not always easy. There are still days when the weight of it all feels like too much. But those days are fewer now. And for that, I'm grateful. The hardest thing I've ever had to do is forgive myself. It's an ongoing process, one I may never fully complete. But I'm learning to live with that. I'm learning that forgiveness isn't about forgetting, it's about accepting. Accepting the past, accepting who you've been, and choosing to move forward anyway. Because mistakes teach us things we might never learn otherwise. They force us to confront the parts of ourselves we'd rather ignore, to grow in ways we didn't know we could. And while I'll always regret what I did, I'm also grateful for the lessons it taught me. Sometimes, the worst mistakes teach us the most important lessons. And while I'll never undo the pain I've caused, I can choose to be better every day. So now I ask you, have you ever made a choice you couldn't take back? A decision that changed everything and left you wondering how to move forward? How did you find your way? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Because if there's one thing I've learned, it's that we're all human. We all make mistakes. But it's what we do next that defines who we are.